The ancient roots of the Fairfax family trace back to the mist-shrouded valleys of northern England, where their name first appeared in feudal records during the reign of Henry II. But even then, whispers followed their bloodline like shadows creeping through candlelit halls. Medieval chroniclers wrote of strange births, of children born with teeth already formed, of livestock found drained of blood near Fairfax holdings. The family's coat of arms bore symbols that predated Christian iconography, symbols that local priests refused to bless or even acknowledge. When plague swept through Yorkshire in 1348, decimating entire villages, the Fairfax estate remained untouched. Not a single member of their household fell ill, while their neighbors buried half their population in hastily dug mass graves. Survivors spoke of seeing figures moving through the plague-struck villages at night, collecting something from the dead before dawn broke. The Fairfax granaries remained mysteriously full during years of famine, their harvests abundant when others withered under cursed skies. By the 15th century, the family had established what historians now recognize as a pattern of prosperity built upon inexplicable tragedies befalling those around them. Local records, many later destroyed in convenient fires, documented a series of events that defied natural explanation. Merchant caravans would disappear on roads passing near Fairfax lands, only for the family's wealth to increase substantially in the following months. Rival noble houses would suffer mysterious ailments that physicians couldn't diagnose, clearing political obstacles for Fairfax advancement. The most disturbing accounts come from the family's own servants, those few brave enough to speak before meeting untimely ends themselves. They described rituals conducted in the estate's ancient foundations, chambers that existed before any recorded construction. These underground spaces, accessed through hidden passages behind false walls, contained artifacts that servants claimed hurt to look upon directly. Stone altars worn smooth by centuries of use, walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, and pools of liquid that reflected no light, yet somehow moved with their own current. Eleanor Fairfax, writing in her private journal in 1476, documented what she called the family's burden. Her entries, discovered centuries later, hidden within a false bottom of a jewelry box, reveal a woman torn between horror and acceptance of her bloodline's true nature. She wrote of monthly gatherings, where family members would descend into what she termed the deep places, emerging changed in ways that took days to fully manifest. Their eyes would hold depths that hadn't existed before. Their voices would carry harmonics that made listeners uneasy, and they would possess knowledge of events occurring hundreds of miles away. The journal describes a ritual Eleanor witnessed as a young woman, where her grandfather stood before what she called the speaking stone, a monolith that predated their estate by millennia. As he pressed his palms against its surface, his blood seeping into microscopic cracks in the ancient rock, voices would emerge from the stone itself. Not echoes or acoustical tricks, but distinct voices speaking in languages that existed before written history. These voices would provide guidance, warnings, and most disturbing of all, demands for payment. Payment, Eleanor discovered, always came in the form of suffering. Not their own suffering, but that of others. The family's prosperity required a constant supply of misery from those around them. Failed harvests that drove neighboring farmers to desperation, plagues that struck competing merchant families, accidents that befell anyone who challenged Fairfax interests. Eleanor wrote that she initially believed these were merely fortunate coincidences, but gradually realized that each stroke of luck for her family corresponded precisely with specific tragedies orchestrated through means she couldn't comprehend. The pattern extended beyond mere business dealings. Fairfax marriages were notoriously successful, but only after potential rivals for their chosen partners suffered mysterious fates. Fairfax children excelled in their studies, while their classmates struggled with sudden learning difficulties. The family's health remained robust, while physicians treating other noble houses reported unprecedented numbers of patients with symptoms that defied medical understanding. Most chilling were Eleanor's descriptions of the family's children. From birth, they displayed abilities that she struggled to document without sounding mad. Infants would stop crying when approached by strangers, but their silence wasn't peaceful. Instead, they would stare with an intensity that made adults profoundly uncomfortable. As they grew, these children demonstrated an uncanny ability to know things they couldn't possibly have learned. They would speak of events from before their birth with first-hand familiarity, recognize people they'd never met, and display skills in languages and crafts they'd never been taught. Eleanor noted that family members seemed to age differently as well. While they lived longer than their contemporaries, their longevity came with peculiar side effects. Their hair would remain dark well into advanced age, but their eyes would gradually develop an opacity that made others avoid direct eye contact. Their voices would deepen with harmonics that resonated in listeners' chests rather than their ears. Most disturbing, they would begin speaking in their sleep, carrying on conversations in languages that scholars couldn't identify, responding to questions no one had asked. The journal reveals that the family maintained detailed genealogical records that extended far beyond typical noble documentation. These records, kept in the deepest chambers of their estate, traced bloodlines not just through human ancestry, but through what Eleanor cryptically referred to as the old connections. These charts mapped relationships to entities that existed before human civilization, beings that had entered into compacts with the earliest Fairfax ancestors in exchange for power and prosperity. By the late 15th century, the family had begun expanding their influence beyond their Yorkshire stronghold. Eleanor documented expeditions to remote locations throughout Britain, journeys undertaken not for trade or diplomacy, but to locate what she called sister stones. These were monoliths similar to the speaking stone in their family's foundations, ancient markers that formed a network across the landscape. At each location, family members would perform rituals that Eleanor described as awakenings, ceremonies that restored connections dormant for centuries. The consequences of these awakenings became apparent in the regions surrounding each stone. Local populations would experience waves of inexplicable misfortune. Crops would fail in patterns that formed geometric shapes visible only from elevated vantage points. Livestock would be found arranged in precise circles, unmarked but lifeless. Wells would run dry despite abundant groundwater, forcing communities to abandon settlements that had thrived for generations. Eleanor's final entries describe a growing sense of dread as she realized the true scope of her family's activities. The prosperity they enjoyed wasn't simply the result of supernatural assistance, but payment for their role in a much larger design. The Fairfax bloodline served as conduits for entities that existed beyond human understanding, beings that sought to influence the physical world through human intermediaries. Each generation of the family bound themselves more deeply to this service, trading their humanity for power that came with increasingly demanding requirements. The journal ends abruptly with an entry dated October 31st, 1478. Eleanor wrote that she had discovered the family's ultimate purpose, but before she could document her revelation, the pages become illegible, not torn or damaged, but covered with symbols that seem to writhe when examined closely. Modern analysis of these markings has proven inconclusive, with experts unable to determine whether they were created with ink burned into the paper or formed through some other means entirely. What remains clear from Eleanor's documentation is that by the late medieval period, the Fairfax family had established a pattern of prosperity built upon supernatural alliances that would define their bloodline for centuries to come. Their wealth and influence weren't earned through conventional means, but granted in exchange for their service to entities whose goals remained hidden beneath layers of ritual and tradition. As the family prepared to face the changing world of the Renaissance, they carried with them not just accumulated wealth and political connections, but a burden of knowledge that set them apart from ordinary nobility. They understood that their prosperity came with costs that would be paid not by themselves, but by countless others whose suffering fed the ancient hungers that had first drawn their ancestors into darkness. The medieval foundations of the Fairfax legacy reveal a family that had already crossed lines that other bloodlines never approached. Their success came not from ambition or intelligence alone, but from their willingness to serve purposes that predated human civilization. As the Fairfax bloodline crept into the Renaissance, their ancient pacts began demanding more than mere offerings. The whispered agreements struck in those subterranean chambers evolved into something far more sinister. Where previous generations had simply fed the stones with suffering, the new era required the family to become instruments of a darker purpose. The entities that had blessed them with prosperity now demanded active participation in reshaping the very fabric of human society. By 1542, Thomas Fairfax had established himself as a prominent wool merchant in London, his wealth seemingly materializing from thin air. His competitors watched in bewilderment as his trade routes flourished while theirs faltered. Ships carrying Fairfax goods arrived at ports with impossible punctuality, their cargo holds filled with textiles of extraordinary quality that commanded prices no rational market should have supported. What these rivals couldn't have known was that Thomas conducted his true business in the cellars beneath his Cheapside warehouse, where ancient stones, transported piece by piece from the family's northern stronghold, pulsed with that same malevolent energy his ancestors had first encountered centuries earlier. The relocation of these monoliths had been no simple task. Each stone required a specific ritual preparation before transport, involving the blood of 13 different bloodlines and incantations that left those who spoke them temporarily mute for days afterward. The stones themselves seemed to resist movement, growing impossibly heavy when threatened with displacement. Thomas's journal, discovered centuries later during renovations of a building that had once housed his warehouse, described the transportation process in disturbing detail. "The first stone fought us for 7 days and nights," he wrote in his peculiar cipher. "It sang in frequencies that made our bones ache and our teeth loosen in their sockets. The horses would not approach the cart, and even the oxen we procured from the countryside fled when brought within sight of our burden. Only when young Margaret offered her firstborn did the stone consent to movement, though it demanded immediate payment. The child was barely 3 months old when it simply stopped breathing in the night, though no physician could determine cause." Once established in London, Thomas discovered that the stone's influence extended far beyond mere commercial success. The entities speaking through them had developed an appetite for information, specifically knowledge that could be used to manipulate the political landscape of Tudor England. Through methods that defied explanation, the stones provided Thomas with intelligence about court intrigues, foreign conspiracies, and private scandals that he then sold to the highest bidder. His network of informants allegedly included courtiers, merchants, and clergy, though records suggest many of these individuals had no conscious knowledge of their role in feeding information to the Fairfax network. The mechanism of this intelligence gathering became clear through testimonies collected during a secret investigation ordered by Elizabeth I herself. Witnesses described encountering Thomas Fairfax in their dreams, where he appeared not as the modest wool merchant they knew during waking hours, but as a figure of commanding presence surrounded by shadows that moved independently of any light source. In these dream encounters, individuals found themselves compelled to share secrets they had sworn never to reveal, often awakening with no memory of the nocturnal confession but plagued by an inexplicable sense of guilt and violation. According to his account, these dream meetings occurred with increasing frequency among London's elite during the 1550s and 1560s. "They come when the moon wanes," he wrote, "entering sleep like thieves in the night. The dreamer finds themselves in a chamber that exists nowhere in the waking world, with walls that seem to breathe and floors that pulse like living flesh. Master Fairfax sits upon a throne carved from what appears to be bone, though bone of what creature I dare not speculate. His questions probe the deepest recesses of one's knowledge, and resistance proves impossible. What made these supernatural interrogations particularly insidious was their psychological aftermath. Victims reported lasting changes in their mental state, developing an almost parasitic need to uncover secrets from others. They became compulsive eavesdroppers, developing uncanny abilities to detect lies and hidden motivations in their social circles. This created a self-perpetuating network of intelligence gathering that spread through London's upper classes like a contagion. The more secrets these individuals collected, the more vivid and frequent their dream encounters with Thomas Fairfax became, creating an addiction-like cycle that bound them ever more tightly to the Fairfax Information Network. Meanwhile, Thomas's children exhibited the hereditary peculiarities that marked their bloodline, though adapted to their urban environment. His eldest son, William, possessed an unsettling ability to predict market fluctuations with supernatural accuracy. Merchants who followed his advice invariably prospered, while those who opposed his recommendations faced financial ruin. His daughter, Catherine, developed what contemporaries described as an ability to see into people's hearts, discerning their deepest desires and fears with a single glance. This gift made her an invaluable asset in marriage negotiations and political alliances, though those who spent time in her presence often reported feeling spiritually drained afterward. The Fairfax influence during this period extended into England's religious upheavals. As the country oscillated between Catholic and Protestant rule, the family maintained profitable relationships with both sides, somehow always positioning themselves as valuable allies regardless of which faction held power. Their ability to predict religious persecutions before they began allowed them to warn certain individuals while ensuring others faced their fate, creating a complex web of obligations and dependencies that strengthened their position with each regime change. Thomas's private correspondence, written in the same cipher used by his ancestors, reveals the true source of this prescient knowledge. The ancient voices speak of patterns that repeat across centuries, he wrote to a cousin. They see the movements of men as we might observe ants in their hills, predictable in their responses to specific stimuli. When we feed them properly, they share glimpses of these patterns, allowing us to position ourselves advantageously before events unfold. The nature of these sacrifices became apparent through a series of unexplained deaths that plagued London during Thomas's rise to prominence. Between 1543 and 1567, over 200 individuals died under circumstances that confounded medical understanding. Victims appeared to simply waste away, losing weight and vitality despite showing no symptoms of known diseases. They became increasingly lethargic and withdrawn, often reporting vivid nightmares involving underground chambers and whispering voices. Most disturbing was their unanimous descriptions of feeling as though something was slowly draining away their life essence, leaving them as hollow shells of their former selves. These deaths followed a distinct pattern that only became apparent when a Jesuit priest named Father Martinez began documenting them in secret. Every victim had, within the months preceding their decline, conducted some form of business with Thomas Fairfax. Some had been his direct competitors who had initially prospered before suddenly facing catastrophic losses. Others were individuals who had possessed information valuable to his intelligence network. A few were craftsmen or artisans whose skills had contributed to his operations. Father Martinez's investigation, discovered in the Vatican archives centuries later, concluded that these deaths represented a form of spiritual predation unlike anything documented in Christian theology. The Fairfax merchant has made alliance with entities that feed upon the essence of human souls, Martinez wrote in his final report before his own mysterious disappearance. They do not simply kill the body, but consume something far more precious, leaving behind animated flesh that gradually fails as the spiritual foundation crumbles. I have observed victims in their final stages, and they speak of dreams where they find themselves in underground chambers, offering portions of themselves to shadowy figures whose hunger can never be satisfied. The Fairfax family's influence during Elizabeth's reign reached its pinnacle when Thomas's son William gained access to the court itself. His appointment as a minor functionary in the royal household seemed unremarkable, but his rapid advancement suggested supernatural assistance. Within 5 years, he had become one of the Queen's most trusted advisors on matters of trade and foreign intelligence. His counsel proved so valuable that Elizabeth reportedly consulted him before making major policy decisions, despite his relatively humble origins. William's success at court stemmed from his ability to provide the Queen with information that proved consistently accurate and valuable. He correctly predicted the outcomes of foreign campaigns, warned of assassination plots before they could develop, and identified the traitors within the court with uncanny precision. What Elizabeth could not have known was that this intelligence came at a horrific cost. William's private journals, written in the evolved cipher his family had developed over generations, described the increasingly demanding rituals required to maintain his supernatural information network. The ancient hunger grows more specific in its requirements, he wrote in 1575. No longer satisfied with the gradual drain of life force from our network of dreamers, the voices demand more direct offerings. They speak of a great work approaching, a transformation that will require unprecedented sacrifice. The nature of this great work became clearer through archaeological discoveries made in the 20th century beneath London's financial district. Construction workers excavating for a new underground station in 1923 broke through into a chamber that had been sealed for centuries. Inside, they found evidence of ritual activities that predated known human habitation of the area. The chamber walls were covered with symbols that bore no resemblance to any known writing system, carved so deep into the stone that they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. At the chamber's center lay an altar constructed from blocks of the same unusual stone found at the Fairfax ancestral sites, its surface stained with substances that analysis could not identify. Most disturbing were the carefully arranged remains of over 50 individuals positioned in concentric circles around the altar. Forensic examination revealed that these people had died over a period of several decades during the late 16th century, their bodies showing signs of ritualistic preparation. Each skeleton bore identical marks where portions of bone had been systematically removed, apparently while the victims were still alive. Carbon dating confirmed that these deaths coincided exactly with William Fairfax's period of influence at Elizabeth's court. The discovery triggered a secret government investigation that was quickly classified and buried. The report concluded that the Fairfax family had established a temple dedicated to entities whose nature defies conventional theological classification, and recommended that all evidence be sealed to prevent public panic. By the time William died in 1589, the Fairfax influence had evolved into something resembling a shadow government within Elizabeth's administration. Key decisions affecting trade, foreign policy, and domestic security were filtered through a network of officials who had fallen under Fairfax influence through various supernatural means. These individuals, while maintaining their outward loyalty to the crown, found themselves compelled to advance Fairfax interests even when doing so conflicted with their conscious intentions. The mechanism of this control became evident through the confessions of Sir Robert Ashworth, a court official who broke free from Fairfax influence shortly before his death in 1591. His testimony, preserved in the private papers of the Archbishop of Canterbury, described a form of spiritual bondage that operated through shared dreams and supernatural compulsions. "We thought ourselves loyal servants of Her Majesty," Ashworth wrote, "yet found ourselves enacting policies that served darker masters. In our sleep, we gathered in that accursed chamber beneath the city, where shadows wore the faces of men and ancient voices directed our waking actions. As Elizabeth's reign drew to a close, the Fairfax family began preparing for a new phase of their supernatural alliance. The entities speaking through their ancestral stones had grown more demanding and more specific in their requirements. They spoke of a coming age when their influence would no longer be limited to dreams and subtle manipulations, but would manifest directly in the physical world. The groundwork laid during the Tudor period had created the spiritual infrastructure necessary for this transformation, binding hundreds of souls to their will and establishing ritual sites throughout London that could serve as anchors for their manifestation. The transition to the Stuart period would bring new opportunities and new horrors as the Fairfax bloodline adapted to changing times while maintaining their ancient obligations. The stones that had guided their ancestors through plague and prosperity now whispered of grander ambitions, of a future where the boundary between the supernatural and mundane would dissolve entirely, and where their family would serve as the conduit through which primordial forces would reclaim dominion over human civilization. The cost of their continued prosperity had escalated from individual sacrifice to systematic predation, from local influence to national manipulation. Each generation found themselves bound more tightly to their supernatural patrons, their humanity eroding as they became instruments of an agenda that stretched across centuries. As the 18th century dawned, the Fairfax influence had grown beyond mere regional power into something resembling a shadow government operating within the highest echelons of British society. Their ancient pacts had evolved, the primordial entities they served now demanding not just blood and suffering, but the very fabric of civilization itself. The family's supernatural gifts had become more pronounced with each generation, yet so too had the terrible price they paid for wielding such dark authority. During the reign of Queen Anne, Edmund Fairfax secured a position as royal advisor on colonial affairs. His uncanny ability to predict political upheavals making him invaluable to the crown. What the royal court didn't understand was that Edmund's prophetic abilities stemmed from his communion with entities that existed outside linear time, beings that whispered of future events during the family's monthly rituals in the underground chambers beneath London. These sessions had grown more elaborate, requiring not just animal sacrifices, but human offerings carefully selected from the city's most desperate populations. The ritual chambers themselves had expanded into a vast network stretching beneath multiple London boroughs, connected by tunnels that predated Roman occupation. Archaeological evidence suggests these passages were carved using methods that modern engineering cannot explain, with walls bearing the same inexplicable symbols found at ancient sites across Britain. The chambers contained altars made from stones that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and pools of liquid that moved against gravity, reaching upward like grasping fingers whenever the family performed their ceremonies. By 1720, the Fairfax network included 13 primary bloodlines, each responsible for maintaining specific aspects of the ancient compact. The Ashworth branch controlled maritime trade routes, their ships never suffering storms or pirate attacks while competitors mysteriously vanished in calm seas. The Blackwood lineage managed agricultural production across 3 counties, their lands yielding impossible harvests while neighboring farms succumbed to blight and pestilence. The Ravencroft family dominated the wool trade, their flocks multiplying at supernatural rates, while other shepherds reported livestock found drained of blood in perfect circles. Each branch practiced variations of the core rituals, but all involved the same fundamental exchange: human life force for supernatural advantage. The methods had become increasingly sophisticated as the family's understanding of the entities they served deepened. Rather than simple blood offerings, they now practiced what they called soul binding, a process that drained not just life, but consciousness itself from their victims. The captured essence was stored in crystalline formations that grew within the underground chambers, pulsing with an inner light that hurt to observe directly. The family's children were born displaying increasingly inhuman characteristics. Many possessed eyes that reflected light, like nocturnal predators, skin that felt unnaturally cold to the touch, and an ability to sense the emotional states of others with disturbing accuracy. More troubling, they aged at irregular rates, some appearing decades older than their chronological age, while others remained youthful far beyond normal human spans. Physical examinations, when permitted, revealed internal anatomical variations that physicians struggled to explain or document. The Fairfax influence extended into the emerging banking systems of the early 18th century, where their supernatural foresight allowed them to manipulate markets with devastating precision. The South Sea Bubble of 1720 was orchestrated through their machinations, a deliberate economic catastrophe designed to consolidate wealth while generating the mass suffering their entities demanded. Thousands of families were ruined, their despair and anguish somehow channeled through the ritual network to feed the ancient powers that sustained Fairfax prosperity. During this period, the family began experimenting with what they termed temporal displacement, attempting to extend their influence across different time periods simultaneously. The underground chambers were modified to include complex arrangements of the ancient stones, positioned according to astronomical calculations that required knowledge of celestial mechanics centuries ahead of contemporary science. These configurations allegedly allowed communication not just with entities from other dimensions, but with past and future versions of the family itself. The ritual practices during the Georgian era reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and horror. The family had learned to harvest specific emotions from their victims, understanding that different forms of suffering provided different types of supernatural energy. Fear generated one form of power, despair another, while the agony of betrayal by loved ones provided the most potent energy of all. They developed elaborate psychological torments designed to extract maximum emotional trauma before the final sacrifice. Their victims were selected through an extensive intelligence network that identified individuals whose disappearances would cause minimal investigation. Orphans, immigrants, and the mentally ill comprised the majority of those taken, though the family occasionally targeted specific individuals whose suffering would resonate through larger social networks. The psychological impact of these disappearances created waves of anxiety and paranoia that the entities seemed to feed upon as readily as individual deaths. The family's political influence reached its zenith during the Jacobite risings, where they manipulated both sides of the conflict to maximize casualties and social disruption. Edmund Fairfax served as an unofficial advisor to government forces, while his cousin Margaret provided intelligence to Jacobite sympathizers, ensuring that battles occurred at locations where the ancient stone network could channel the resulting bloodshed into supernatural energy. The sites of major engagements consistently aligned with prehistoric monuments, a pattern that military historians have noted but never successfully explained. By 1745, the Fairfax network had established ritual sites throughout Scotland, taking advantage of the political chaos to conduct ceremonies at stone circles and burial mounds that had been sacred to pre-Christian civilizations. These locations amplified their supernatural abilities, allowing communication with entities that claimed to remember the formation of the British Isles themselves. The family's journals from this period describe beings of such alien intelligence that prolonged contact left participants permanently altered, their minds stretched to accommodate concepts that human consciousness was never meant to contain. The transformation of family members became increasingly pronounced as the century progressed. Several branches developed what they termed the sight, an ability to perceive supernatural entities and energies invisible to normal humans. This gift came at a terrible cost, as those who possessed it reported seeing horrific beings everywhere, entities that fed on human misery and seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Many family members required constant medication to function in normal society, their minds barely capable of processing the supernatural horror they perceived constantly. The family's breeding practices became systematically controlled during this period, with marriages arranged not for social advancement, but to preserve and enhance supernatural abilities. They maintained detailed genealogical records that tracked not just bloodlines, but the specific supernatural traits each union might produce. Children who failed to manifest the desired abilities were quietly eliminated, while those who showed promise underwent intensive training in ritual practices from early childhood. The underground network beneath London expanded throughout the 1750s and 1760s, with new chambers excavated beneath key government buildings and wealthy residential areas. The family had learned to construct these spaces using techniques that left no trace of conventional construction, with walls that seemed to have been grown rather than built. The chambers contained libraries of texts written in languages that predated known human civilization, detailing ritual practices and supernatural knowledge accumulated over millennia. As the century progressed, the entities the family served began making increasingly demanding requests. No longer satisfied with periodic sacrifices, they required constant feeding of human suffering and began influencing global events to generate the massive casualties they craved. The 7 Years' War was orchestrated through Fairfax manipulation of diplomatic channels, with family members embedded in multiple European courts, ensuring that conflicts escalated beyond rational political objectives. The family's supernatural abilities reached unprecedented levels during the 1760s, with several members demonstrating powers that bordered on the impossible. They could allegedly influence weather patterns over vast areas, cause livestock diseases that spread according to their will, and manipulate the dreams of individuals hundreds of miles away. These abilities required increasingly elaborate ritual practices, with ceremonies lasting for days and involving dozens of participants, arranged in complex geometric patterns within the underground chambers. The psychological toll on family members became increasingly severe as their supernatural abilities strengthened. Many developed what they termed the hunger, an insatiable need to witness or cause suffering in others. This compulsion grew stronger with each generation, leading to increasingly elaborate torments inflicted on both enemies and innocent victims. The family's private journals describe this hunger as a living thing that consumed their humanity piece by piece, leaving them as hollow vessels for the entities they served. By the 1770s, the Fairfax influence had spread to the American colonies, where family members established ritual sites at key locations that would later become major cities. The growing tensions between Britain and the colonies provided perfect opportunities for the supernatural harvest of mass suffering, with family members manipulating both sides to ensure maximum bloodshed. The Boston Massacre and similar incidents were orchestrated through their network of agents and supernatural influence. The family's ultimate goal became clear through documents recovered from abandoned ritual sites. They sought to weaken the barriers between dimensions sufficiently to allow their entities to manifest permanently in the physical world. This process required the systematic destruction of human civilization's stabilizing influences, replacing them with chaos and suffering that would reshape reality itself. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the various European conflicts of the late 18th century were all steps in this apocalyptic plan. As the century drew to a close, the Fairfax family had evolved into something that could barely be called human. Their bodies were sustained by supernatural energy rather than normal biological processes. Their minds expanded to accommodate alien knowledge that would drive ordinary people to madness. They had become conduits for entities that viewed human civilization as nothing more than a feeding ground, and their success in manipulating global events suggested that their ultimate goal of dimensional convergence was becoming terrifyingly achievable. The 19th century would bring new challenges as industrialization and scientific advancement threatened to expose their supernatural activities. But the family's centuries of accumulated power and knowledge had prepared them for this evolution. The 19th century marked a turning point for the Fairfax lineage as they adapted their ancient practices to the rapidly changing world of industrialization and scientific advancement. No longer content to merely influence events from the shadows, they began to actively reshape human civilization itself, using their accumulated wealth and supernatural abilities to establish vast networks of control that would permeate every aspect of modern society. The family's transformation during this period was both systematic and terrifying. Where once they had operated as isolated practitioners of dark rituals, they now evolved into a sophisticated occult organization with branches spread across multiple continents. Their success in previous centuries had taught them that human suffering could be harvested on an industrial scale, and the tumultuous 1800s provided unprecedented opportunities for such exploitation. The Fairfax patriarch during this era, Cornelius Fairfax, possessed abilities that defied rational explanation. Witnesses described him as ageless, appearing no older at his death in 1899 than he had 40 years earlier. His eyes held an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to peer directly into the souls of those who met his gaze. More disturbing were the reports of his presence being felt simultaneously in multiple locations, as if his consciousness could fragment and operate independently across vast distances. Under Cornelius's guidance, the family established what they called the Great Working, an ambitious project to weaken the barriers between dimensions on a global scale. This endeavor required precise coordination of traumatic events that would generate the specific types of psychic energy their otherworldly patrons consumed. The family's influence during this period can be traced through seemingly unrelated catastrophes that shared eerily similar characteristics. The Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1852 bore the hallmarks of Fairfax manipulation. While natural factors certainly contributed to the disaster, recently discovered documents suggest that Fairfax agents deliberately sabotaged relief efforts and manipulated British policy to maximize suffering. The family maintained a network of informants within the British government who ensured that aid was systematically misdirected or delayed. More sinister were the reports of strange rituals performed in remote Irish villages during the height of the famine, conducted by hooded figures who spoke in languages that predated recorded history. Survivors of these encounters described ceremonies involving the deliberate starvation of entire families while their life force was somehow extracted and contained within crystalline objects of unknown composition. The Fairfax believed that suffering endured over extended periods produced a more potent form of psychic energy than sudden death, and the prolonged agony of the famine provided an ideal testing ground for their theories. The American Civil War presented an even greater opportunity for the family's dark harvest. Fairfax agents had been quietly infiltrating both Northern and Southern society for decades, carefully nurturing the tensions that would eventually tear the nation apart. They funded radical abolitionists and pro-slavery extremists with equal enthusiasm, not out of any political conviction, but because they understood that the most devastating conflicts arise when both sides believe themselves to be fighting for righteous causes. During the war itself, the family established what they called collection points, locations where particularly intense battles would inevitably occur. These sites, chosen for their specific geological and astronomical properties, served as focal points for gathering the psychic energy released by mass death. The Battle of Gettysburg, occurring during a rare celestial alignment, was particularly significant to their purposes. Local folklore from the period describes strange lights hovering over the battlefield in the days following the carnage, and several Union soldiers reported encounters with figures in dark robes who moved among the dead, performing incomprehensible rituals. The family's influence extended beyond orchestrating conflicts to actively prolonging them. Whenever peace negotiations showed promise, mysterious assassinations or provocative incidents would reignite hostilities. The assassination of President Lincoln himself bears suspicious similarities to previous Fairfax operations, though their involvement remains unproven. What is certain is that the family's power grew exponentially during the war years, as evidenced by their sudden acquisition of vast industrial holdings and their ability to manipulate financial markets with supernatural precision. Perhaps most disturbing was their experimentation with what they termed genetic refinement during this period. The family had long understood that their supernatural abilities could be enhanced through selective breeding, but the 19th century saw them apply these principles with scientific rigor. They established a network of seemingly legitimate medical institutions across Europe and America, facilities that served as covers for their breeding programs. These institutions, disguised as hospitals for the treatment of rare genetic disorders, actually functioned as laboratories where the family conducted horrific experiments on human subjects. Their goal was to create a hybrid bloodline that could serve as perfect conduits for their otherworldly patrons while retaining enough humanity to operate within normal society. The subjects of these experiments were typically individuals with unusual psychic sensitivities, people who could perceive supernatural phenomena but lacked the training to defend themselves against psychic manipulation. The results of these experiments were documented in journals written in a cipher that took modern cryptographers nearly a century to decode. The translated texts reveal procedures that combined surgical mutilation with ritual magic, creating beings that were neither fully human nor entirely otherworldly. These hybrid creatures possessed abilities that included telepathic communication, the capacity to exist partially outside normal space-time, and the horrifying ability to feed on human consciousness directly. By the 1870s, the family had established a global network of these hybrid agents, beings who could infiltrate any level of society while maintaining constant psychic contact with their Fairfax masters. These creatures were instrumental in the family's most ambitious project of the century, the creation of what they called the Resonance Web, a psychic network that would eventually encompass the entire planet. The Resonance Web operated through a series of specially constructed monuments and buildings that served as psychic amplifiers. These structures, built in major cities around the world, were designed according to principles that combined ancient occult knowledge with cutting-edge architectural techniques. To the casual observer, they appeared to be normal civic buildings, museums, or private residences. In reality, they functioned as nodes in a vast supernatural communication network that allowed the family to monitor and influence human behavior on an unprecedented scale. The construction of these nodes required materials that could only be obtained through the most horrific means. The foundations of each building were mixed with soil from sites of mass death, while the walls incorporated ground bone from victims of specific types of violence. Most disturbing were the living components built into each structure, human subjects who were surgically modified and then sealed within the building's walls while still conscious. These unfortunate souls served as living batteries, their perpetual suffering providing the psychic energy necessary to power the network. The family's influence during the Industrial Revolution was particularly insidious because they understood that technological progress could be weaponized for their purposes. They invested heavily in railroad companies, not for financial gain, but because they recognized that rail networks could serve as conduits for psychic energy. The specific routes chosen for major railroad lines were influenced by Fairfax agents who ensured that the tracks would connect their various ritual sites, creating a transportation system that doubled as a massive occult symbol when viewed from above. The family's manipulation of industrial development extended to the mining industry, where they used their supernatural abilities to locate deposits of rare minerals that possessed unusual properties. These materials, which conventional geology could not explain, were essential components in the construction of increasingly sophisticated ritual implements. The family's mines, scattered across remote locations on every continent, produce substances that seem to exist partially in other dimensions, materials that could be shaped by willpower alone, and that retained psychic impressions for centuries. The workers in these mines faced conditions that went beyond mere physical hardship. The constant exposure to otherworldly materials gradually transformed them into something barely recognizable as human. Their bodies became elongated and pale, their eyes developed an unsettling luminescence, and their minds became increasingly detached from normal human concerns. Thus transformed workers, known within the family as the Hollowed, served as perfect employees because they felt no pain, required minimal sustenance, and could work continuously without rest. The family's financial empire during this period was built on more than mere business acumen. They had developed techniques for manipulating probability itself, ensuring that their investments would always yield extraordinary returns. This supernatural influence over chance extended to their involvement in the stock markets, where they could predict and even cause market fluctuations through the careful application of their otherworldly knowledge. The Panic of 1873, one of the most severe economic depressions in American history, was deliberately triggered by Fairfax agents who understood that widespread financial suffering would generate the type of despair their patrons found particularly nourishing. The family's ability to profit from such disasters while simultaneously feeding on the psychic energy they produced made them increasingly powerful with each economic crisis they orchestrated. As the century progressed, the family's supernatural abilities continued to evolve in disturbing ways. Individual family members began to exhibit powers that transcended the merely psychic, displaying abilities that suggested their human nature was being systematically replaced by something far more alien. They could survive injuries that should have been fatal, manipulate matter at the molecular level, and exist simultaneously in multiple locations. Most terrifying was their apparent ability to perceive and manipulate the fundamental forces that govern reality itself. The family's children, born during this period of accelerated supernatural evolution, represented a new phase in their development. These offspring bore little resemblance to normal human children, displaying abilities from birth that would have been considered miraculous in previous generations. They could communicate telepathically before they could speak, manipulate objects with their minds, and perceive events occurring in distant locations with perfect clarity. More disturbing were the reports of these children's emotional development, or rather, their complete lack thereof. They displayed no empathy, no capacity for genuine human connection, and no interest in anything beyond the family's dark mission. They viewed ordinary humans as insects, might view bacteria as simple organisms useful only for exploitation. This emotional void was not a flaw in their development, but rather a feature deliberately cultivated by the family's breeding programs. The education of these supernatural children took place in facilities that existed partially outside normal space-time, locations where the laws of physics operated according to different principles. These schools, if they could be called that, were designed to strip away any remaining vestiges of human nature while enhancing the students' otherworldly abilities. The curriculum included subjects that would have driven normal minds to madness: the mathematics of dimensional manipulation, the linguistics of entities that existed before the birth of stars, and the practical application of suffering as a source of energy. By the 1890s, the family had achieved a level of influence that would have been unimaginable to their medieval ancestors. They controlled major banks, industrial corporations, and transportation networks. Their agents held positions of power in governments around the world. Their hybrid creatures had infiltrated every level of society, from the highest halls of power to the most remote rural communities. Yet their ultimate goal remained unchanged from the dark pact made centuries earlier in the mists of northern England. They sought to facilitate the physical manifestation of their otherworldly patrons in our reality, to create conditions that would allow beings of unimaginable power and malevolence to cross the dimensional barriers that had previously contained them. The 19th century had served as a crucial preparation phase for this ultimate objective. The family had established the infrastructure necessary to coordinate a global-scale ritual that would weaken the barriers between worlds to the point of complete collapse. They had created hybrid beings capable of surviving in a reality where the laws of physics no longer applied consistently. They had accumulated the resources necessary to implement their plan on a scale that would affect every living creature on Earth. As the century drew to a close, the family's patriarch, Cornelius Fairfax, conducted one final ritual in the ancient chambers beneath their ancestral estate. The ceremony, witnessed only by his most trusted descendants, involved the sacrifice of dozens of carefully selected victims whose deaths would serve as a signal to their otherworldly patrons that the final phase of their plan was about to begin. The ritual's completion was marked by phenomena that defied rational explanation. The very air within the chamber seemed to thicken and take on a life of its own. Shadows moved independently of any light source, and whispers in languages that predated human speech echoed from invisible sources. Most disturbing were the brief glimpses of otherworldly entities that seemed to peer through tears in reality itself, beings whose forms suggested intelligence so alien that human minds could barely comprehend their existence. The success of this final 19th century ritual set in motion events that would define the family's activities in the coming century. The dimensional barriers had been weakened to the point where limited manifestations of their patrons could occur, brief appearances that served as both rewards for the family's centuries of service and previews of the complete transformation that awaited humanity. The Fairfax family entered the 20th century with abilities that bordered on the divine, resources that spanned the globe, and a network of influence that penetrated every aspect of human civilization. They had transformed from a small clan of medieval practitioners into a supernatural force capable of reshaping reality itself according to their will. The stage was set for the final act of their ancient plan, a culmination that would either see their otherworldly patrons achieve complete dominion over our reality, or result in the destruction of everything they had worked for across the centuries. The choice, if it could be called that, would ultimately rest with humanity itself, though few would ever realize the true nature of the forces arrayed against them. The 19th century had been merely the preparation. The late 19th century marked the culmination of the Fairfax bloodline's most audacious undertaking, a ritual so vast in scope that it would forever alter the boundary between our world and the primordial realm their ancestors had courted for centuries. By 1889, 4 generations of careful preparation had positioned the family at the apex of both worldly power and occult mastery. their influence threading through the highest echelons of British society like veins of corruption through marble. Lord Percival Fairfax, now the family patriarch, had inherited not merely estates and titles, but a psychic network spanning 3 continents. The family's reach extended far beyond their ancestral holdings in Yorkshire, with branches established in key locations across the globe, each positioned according to calculations derived from their ancient texts. These weren't random settlements, but carefully chosen sites where the Earth's magnetic fields converged with ley lines, creating natural amplification points for their ritualistic work. The Industrial Revolution had provided unexpected advantages to their centuries old agenda. Steam powered machinery allowed them to excavate deeper than ever before, reaching subterranean chambers that had remained sealed since before recorded history. Railway networks facilitated the rapid movement of artifacts, specimens, and family members between ritual sites. Telegraph lines, which they had secretly influenced during their installation, followed patterns that unknowingly created a vast geometric sigil across the British Isles, each transmission carrying minute traces of their influence into the homes and businesses of ordinary citizens. Most significantly, the era's scientific revolution provided perfect camouflage for their activities. What previous generations had been forced to conduct in absolute secrecy could now be disguised as legitimate research. The family established the Fairfax Institute for Anthropological Studies, ostensibly dedicated to understanding primitive cultures and their belief systems. In reality, this institution served as a repository for forbidden knowledge gathered from across the empire, a scholarly facade concealing the systematic collection of ritualistic practices from every corner of the colonized world. The Institute's expeditions ventured into the remotest regions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, not seeking to catalog indigenous customs for academic purposes, but to identify cultures that had maintained contact with the same primordial entities the Fairfax family served. These expeditions returned with more than artifacts and documentation. They brought back living practitioners, individuals whose bloodlines carried genetic modifications similar to those the Fairfax line had cultivated over centuries. These foreign mystics were housed in specially constructed quarters beneath the Institute, their quarters designed according to principles that would have horrified contemporary architects. The walls incorporated materials from every continent, creating chambers that existed partially outside normal space-time. Here, knowledge was exchanged through methods that transcended language, with information passing directly from mind to mind through processes that left participants forever changed. The crossbreeding programs that had begun centuries earlier reached their most sophisticated phase during this period. The family had long understood that their pact required not just human sacrifice, but the creation of hybrid offspring capable of surviving in both dimensions simultaneously. Earlier attempts had produced children who possess supernatural abilities, but inevitably succumbed to madness or physical deterioration before reaching adulthood. By the 1880s, however, they had refined their techniques sufficiently to produce viable hybrids. Those hybrid children displayed remarkable capabilities from birth. They required no instruction to communicate with the entities that haunted Fairfax properties, conversing in languages that predated human speech. Their physical forms adapted to their environment in ways that defied biological understanding, developing additional sensory organs when housed in the family's deeper chambers, or manifesting protective carapaces when exposed to the psychic emanations of particularly powerful artifacts. More disturbing still was their apparent lack of individual identity. Unlike normal children who developed distinct personalities and preferences, the hybrids seemed to share consciousness, responding to events occurring miles away as though they had witnessed them personally. They aged at irregular rates, sometimes remaining physically infantile for years, before suddenly maturing to adolescence within weeks. Medical examinations revealed organs with no known function, circulatory systems that flowed in patterns resembling ritual diagrams, and nervous systems that extended beyond their physical bodies into nearby space. The family's influence within the British government had grown to encompass cabinet ministers, military commanders, and even members of the royal household. This wasn't achieved through conventional bribery or blackmail, but through more insidious means. The Fairfax bloodline had perfected techniques for spiritual contamination, subtle processes that gradually eroded an individual's will while leaving their intellect intact. Victims retained their positions and abilities, but found themselves inexplicably compelled to support Fairfax interests, often while believing they were acting according to their own judgment. Government policies during this period reflected Fairfax influence in ways that contemporary historians have struggled to explain. Military expeditions were diverted to explore regions that appeared strategically worthless but contained sites of occult significance. Trade agreements were structured to facilitate the movement of specific materials that possessed ritualistic properties. Immigration policies were quietly modified to encourage the settlement of individuals from bloodlines the family had identified as genetically compatible with their breeding programs. The family's financial empire had evolved beyond conventional banking and industry. Their investments followed patterns that seemed to defy economic logic, yet consistently generated enormous profits. They purchased properties that appeared worthless until geological surveys revealed rare mineral deposits. They invested in shipping ventures that experienced impossible good fortune, avoiding storms and pirates while discovering new trade routes. Their manufacturing enterprises produced goods that commanded premium prices, despite being indistinguishable from competitors' products, as though consumers were subconsciously compelled to prefer Fairfax-branded items. This commercial success wasn't achieved through superior business acumen, but through systematic manipulation of market forces using techniques derived from their occult practices. They had learned to read economic patterns as earlier generations had read entrails, identifying fluctuations that corresponded to cosmic cycles and planetary alignments. More directly, they employed ritual techniques to influence the decisions of competitors, suppliers, and customers, creating artificial demand for their products while sabotaging rivals through carefully orchestrated misfortunes. The deeper chambers beneath Fairfax properties had expanded into vast underground complexes that stretched for miles beneath the English countryside. These weren't mere cellars or storage areas, but architectural impossibilities that existed in folded space, their dimensions defying conventional geometry. Visitors who attempted to map these areas invariably became lost, discovering rooms that couldn't physically fit within the buildings above them, corridors that led to chambers that should have intersected with neighboring properties, and staircases that descended far deeper than the local geology could accommodate. Within these chambers, the family maintained libraries containing texts that predated human civilization, laboratories where impossible experiments continued for decades without supervision, and nurseries where hybrid offspring were raised according to principles that bore no resemblance to human child-rearing practices. The deeper levels housed entities that had been summoned but not yet fully manifested, beings that existed partially in our dimension while maintaining their connection to realms where different physical laws applied. The family's network of informants and agents had grown to encompass thousands of individuals across multiple continents, most of whom remained unaware of their true role in the Fairfax agenda. Servants in aristocratic households reported conversations and activities to handlers who compiled detailed intelligence on potential threats or opportunities. Clerks in government offices copied documents and forwarded them through channels that ultimately led to Fairfax analysts. Scientists and researchers unknowingly contributed to projects whose true purpose they couldn't fathom, believing their work served conventional academic or commercial interests. This intelligence network operated through methods that combined conventional espionage with supernatural surveillance. Certain family members had developed abilities that allowed them to perceive events occurring at great distances, observing activities in foreign capitals or remote wilderness areas as clearly as though they were present. Others could influence the thoughts and actions of individuals they had never met, planting suggestions or extracting information through psychic contact that left no trace of their intervention. The family's manipulation of religious and educational institutions had reached unprecedented sophistication by this period. They had established seminaries that trained clergy according to curricula that subtly incorporated elements of their ancient faith, producing ministers who unknowingly spread Fairfax influence through their congregations. Educational institutions founded with Fairfax funding emphasized subjects and perspectives that gradually shifted public consciousness toward acceptance of ideas that would have been considered blasphemous or insane in earlier eras. These institutions served as recruitment centers for identifying individuals whose psychological profiles suggested compatibility with Fairfax objectives. Students who demonstrated particular aptitudes were offered scholarships and opportunities that gradually drew them into the family's orbit. Many became lifelong agents without ever realizing they served interests beyond their apparent academic or professional pursuits. Others underwent more direct initiation processes, joining the ranks of conscious collaborators who understood at least portions of the true Fairfax agenda. The great ritual that would define the family's legacy began its active phase during the winter solstice of 1891. This wasn't a single ceremony, but a coordinated series of events spanning multiple years and involving participants across 3 continents. The preparation alone required the sacrifice of over 300 individuals, carefully selected according to astrological calculations and genetic profiles that had been refined through centuries of experimentation. The primary ceremony took place in chambers that existed simultaneously beneath Yorkshire, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, connected through spatial distortions that allowed participants to move between locations instantaneously. Secondary rituals occurred at Fairfax properties in India, Canada, Australia, and South Africa, with timing coordinated to create overlapping psychic resonances that would amplify the primary working beyond anything previously attempted. The ritual's objective wasn't merely to summon individual entities, but to create permanent breaches in the barriers between dimensions, establishing gateways that would allow unlimited passage for beings that had previously required elaborate ceremonies to manifest temporarily. These gateways would be disguised as natural phenomena, appearing to casual observation as unusual geological formations, atmospheric disturbances, or bodies of water with peculiar properties that discouraged investigation. As the ritual progressed through its multi-year cycle, reality began to shift in subtle but measurable ways around Fairfax properties. Gravitational anomalies appeared in areas where the strongest workings were conducted, with objects falling upward or sideways in defiance of natural law. Time flowed irregularly in certain chambers, with participants aging years during brief ceremonies or remaining unchanged despite spending weeks in ritual preparation. Visitors reported encountering identical individuals in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting that space itself was beginning to fold in response to the family's workings. The final phase would require a sacrifice of unprecedented magnitude, involving not hundreds, but thousands of carefully selected victims whose deaths would provide sufficient energy to complete the dimensional breach permanently. The family had spent decades identifying and positioning these individuals, placing them in locations where their simultaneous deaths would create a geometric pattern spanning continents. The year 1899 marked what historians would later call the convergence, though no academic institution dares acknowledge this designation in official records. During this pivotal moment, the Fairfax network reached its most terrifying milestone. After centuries of patient cultivation, their interdimensional infrastructure had finally matured to the point where reality itself began showing signs of systematic breakdown. The family's hybrid offspring, now numbering in the thousands across 6 continents, had developed abilities that defied natural law. These beings, appearing human to casual observation, possessed consciousness that operated on multiple dimensional frequencies simultaneously. They could perceive events occurring in parallel realities, manipulate probability fields around specific individuals, and most disturbing of all, they could temporarily phase portions of their bodies into what witnesses described as spaces between spaces. Victoria Fairfax, the current matriarch and arguably the most powerful entity the bloodline had ever produced, established her primary residence in a sprawling estate outside London that existed in a state of perpetual architectural impossibility. The mansion's interior contained rooms that were larger than the building's exterior dimensions, corridors that led to locations hundreds of miles away, and chambers where time flowed at dramatically different rates. Visitors who entered the estate for afternoon tea might emerge to discover that weeks had passed in the outside world, while others experienced the reverse phenomenon, aging years during conversations that lasted mere minutes by external clocks. The family's ritual sites had evolved beyond simple ceremonial spaces into what can only be described as dimensional puncture wounds. The original chamber beneath Ravenscroft had expanded into a vast subterranean complex stretching for miles in all directions, with tunnels that somehow connected to similar installations across the globe. These underground networks pulsed with an organic rhythm, their walls secreting a luminescent substance that responded to human neural activity. Scientists who secretly studied samples of this material discovered it contained structures resembling both crystalline formations and living tissue, existing in quantum states that should have been physically impossible. The Fairfax entities they served had grown increasingly impatient for their final manifestation. Their communications, previously subtle influences on human consciousness, had become direct telepathic commands that drove recipients to acts of escalating desperation. Across Europe, individuals from all social classes began experiencing shared nightmares featuring towering figures with geometries that hurt to perceive directly. These dreams invariably ended with the dreamer being compelled to travel to specific locations, usually remote areas, where they would begin excavating ritual sites with their bare hands until they collapsed from exhaustion or died from their efforts. The family's economic manipulation had reached unprecedented sophistication. They now controlled not just markets and currencies, but the fundamental psychological patterns that drove human financial behavior. Through their hybrid agents embedded in banks, trading houses, and government treasuries, they could trigger economic panics or booms by introducing specific combinations of rumors, each carefully crafted to resonate with deep-seated fears buried in the collective unconscious. The Panic of 1893 in America had been a small-scale test of these capabilities, orchestrated to channel the resulting human despair into their ritual network through a process they called harvesting. But their most ambitious project involved what they termed the Great Working, a planetary-scale ritual designed to permanently thin the barriers between dimensions. This required the synchronized activation of hundreds of ritual sites during a specific astronomical alignment that occurred only once every few centuries. The calculation of this alignment had occupied Fairfax scholars for generations, requiring them to account not just for planetary positions, but for the gravitational influences of celestial bodies that existed partially in their patron's dimension. Preparation for the Great Working demanded unprecedented human suffering on a global scale. The family began orchestrating conflicts designed to generate specific types of emotional energy. Unlike their previous interventions, which had focused on regional wars or localized disasters, they now worked to create conditions for worldwide catastrophe. Their agents infiltrated the highest levels of European governments, carefully nurturing the tensions that would eventually explode into global warfare. The hybrid offspring played crucial roles in these preparations. Their ability to perceive multiple probability streams allowed them to identify key individuals whose deaths or manipulated decisions would cascade into maximum chaos. A minor diplomat whose assassination would trigger alliance obligations, a military officer whose particular psychological profile made him ideal for escalating border skirmishes into full-scale invasions, a scientist whose research could be corrupted into weapons of unprecedented destructiveness. More troubling was their development of what they called sympathy networks, systems for amplifying and redirecting human emotional energy across vast distances. These networks utilized both technological innovations and biological components harvested from their ritual sites. Telegraph lines were secretly modified with crystalline structures that could transmit not just electrical signals, but the resonance patterns of human consciousness. Railroad tracks were embedded with materials that absorbed the psychic impressions of travelers, creating pathways for emotional contagion that could spread panic or despair from city to city with frightening efficiency. The family's scientific experiments had progressed far beyond their earlier genetic manipulations. Working in hidden laboratories beneath major European cities, they developed techniques for preserving and transplanting consciousness itself. Death, for the Fairfax bloodline, had become merely an inconvenience. When a family member's physical form failed, their awareness could be transferred into specially prepared hybrid bodies, allowing them to accumulate knowledge and power across multiple lifetimes while maintaining perfect continuity of memory and purpose. These consciousness transfers came with increasingly disturbing side effects. Each iteration left the individual less human and more aligned with the dimensional entities they served. Their thought patterns began operating according to alien logic structures that prioritized outcomes incomprehensible to normal human psychology. Family members who had undergone multiple transfers would sometimes spend hours staring at empty spaces, claiming to perceive colors that didn't exist, or engaging in conversations with beings only they could see. The entities themselves were becoming more active in direct communications, rather than the subtle influences and cryptic visions of previous centuries. They now regularly manifested in partially physical forms during ritual gatherings. These manifestations defied documentation, as cameras would produce only distorted images and recording devices captured sounds that drove listeners to temporary madness. Witnesses described beings that seemed to exist in too many dimensions simultaneously, creating visual paradoxes that caused physical pain to observe directly. Their messages had evolved from promises of power and prosperity to urgent demands for acceleration of the great working. The entities claimed that their own dimension was experiencing some form of crisis that required immediate expansion into human reality. They spoke of cosmic cycles reaching completion, of barriers that were already beginning to deteriorate naturally, and of opportunities that would not recur for millennia if missed during the approaching astronomical alignment. The family's global network had grown to encompass thousands of conscious agents and millions of unconscious collaborators. Every major city contained at least one Fairfax installation, usually hidden beneath seemingly innocuous buildings like libraries, museums, or charitable institutions. These facilities served multiple functions, conducting research into consciousness manipulation, housing breeding programs for hybrid offspring, and maintaining the technological infrastructure necessary for the sympathy networks. Their influence over religious institutions had reached particularly sophisticated levels. Rather than simply corrupting existing faiths, they began founding entirely new spiritual movements designed to channel worship toward their dimensional patrons. These synthetic religions incorporated enough genuine mystical insight to attract sincere seekers, while gradually introducing practices that opened practitioners to direct entity influence. Several of these movements gained substantial followings, particularly among intellectuals and artists who found their conventional beliefs inadequate for explaining the strange phenomena increasingly visible in the world. The art and literature of the period began reflecting the Fairfax influence in subtle but unmistakable ways. Writers found themselves crafting stories that contained hidden geometric patterns that served as weak versions of the family's consciousness affecting symbols. Painters produced works that seemed to shift and move when viewed peripherally, containing visual elements that existed only when not directly observed. Musicians composed pieces that incorporated specific harmonic progressions known to induce trance states and make listeners more susceptible to telepathic influence. As the 19th century drew to a close, signs of the approaching Great Working became visible to those who knew how to interpret them. Aurora displays appeared at latitudes where they had never been recorded, their colors shifting into spectrums that didn't correspond to any known atmospheric phenomena. Sensitive individuals reported increasingly vivid dreams of vast structures rising from beneath the earth, their architecture following principles that seemed to bend space itself into impossible configurations. The family's preparations entered their final phase with the establishment of what they called the nexus points, specific locations where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thinnest. These sites, scattered across the globe according to principles of sacred geometry that incorporated both terrestrial magnetic fields and astronomical alignments, would serve as the focal points for the Great Working. Each nexus point required extensive preparation, including the construction of elaborate underground chambers, the installation of technological amplification systems, and most crucially, the sacrifice of specific numbers of individuals whose consciousness patterns matched predetermined criteria. The selection and preparation of these sacrificial subjects had occupied the family for decades. They required individuals with particular combinations of psychic sensitivity, emotional intensity, and most importantly, complete lack of awareness regarding their intended fate. The victims had to approach their deaths in states of specific emotional configurations, their consciousness patterns perfectly aligned with the dimensional frequencies their deaths would help establish. Victoria Fairfax herself had begun manifesting physical changes that suggested her own transformation was nearing completion. Her appearance fluctuated unpredictably, sometimes seeming decades younger or older than her chronological age, other times displaying features that didn't quite conform to human anatomy. Her eyes had developed an unsettling quality, seeming to contain depths that extended far beyond what should have been physically possible. Those who met her gaze reported seeing brief glimpses of vast spaces filled with geometries that induced immediate vertigo and lasting psychological disturbance. The countdown to the Great Working had begun, with the family's calculations indicating the optimal astronomical alignment would occur within the first decades of the coming century. Every resource they had accumulated over centuries of patient manipulation was now focused on ensuring the success of this final ritual. The consequences of failure were unthinkable, not just for the family, but for the dimensional entities whose own survival apparently depended on successful expansion into human reality. The ritual had been centuries in preparation, a convergence of ancient bloodlines, celestial alignments, and interdimensional mathematics that would have driven sane minds to madness. Victoria Fairfax stood at the center of her underground cathedral, surrounded by 13 stone pedestals, each bearing a hybrid offspring whose veins pulsed with otherworldly luminescence. The air itself trembled with anticipation, reality growing thin as membrane between worlds. Across Britain and beyond, the psychic nodes activated simultaneously. Every stone circle, every ley line intersection, every carefully cultivated site where the Fairfax influence had taken root began resonating with harmonics that preceded creation itself. The network they had spent generations constructing awakened like a vast neural system, each connection amplifying the next until the very foundations of existence began to vibrate. The children, products of unions between Fairfax blood and entities from beyond, began their chorus. Their voices carried frequencies that human ears were never meant to process, sounds that bypassed auditory perception and vibrated directly through bone and sinew. Government officials in London felt inexplicable terror without understanding why. Religious leaders across Europe fell to their knees as ancient prayers turned to ash in their mouths. Scientists monitoring seismic equipment watched in bewilderment as instruments recorded impossible readings, vibrations that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Victoria's transformation accelerated. Her human form had become merely a vessel, inadequate for containing the cosmic intelligence that had been growing within her bloodline for generations. Her skin took on the translucent quality of deep ocean creatures, revealing circulatory systems that pulsed with energies from distant stars. Her eyes expanded beyond human proportions, reflecting dimensions that folded in upon themselves, like origami made from space and time. The matriarch raised her arms, and the assembled hybrids responded by opening wounds along their forearms. Their blood, neither fully human nor entirely alien, flowed in patterns that defied gravity, forming geometric shapes in the air that hurt to perceive directly. These blood sigils hung suspended, rotating slowly as they gathered power from the network of sites across the globe. Deep beneath London, the ancient stones that predated human civilization began to glow. The Fairfax family had discovered these artifacts centuries ago, recognizing them as anchor points for entities that existed between dimensions. Now, as Victoria's ritual reached its crescendo, these stones cracked open like eggs, releasing presences that had been waiting since before the first human drew breath. The hybrid offspring began to change more dramatically. Their carefully maintained human appearance dissolved as their true nature asserted itself. Limbs elongated and multiplied, faces restructured into configurations that served senses beyond the traditional five. They were becoming receivers for their alien patrons, living antennae for intelligences that communicated in ways that bypassed language entirely. Reality shuddered. In Manchester, witnesses reported seeing the sky fold like fabric, revealing glimpses of landscapes where geometry followed different rules. Edinburgh's ancient castle grounds erupted with plant life that grew in impossible spirals, their leaves shifting through colors that had no names in human languages. The Thames reversed its flow for 17 minutes, while fish swam through the air above its surface. Victoria felt the barriers weakening. The dimensional walls her family had been systematically eroding for centuries finally approached their breaking point. Through the cracks, she sensed her patrons gathering, ancient intelligences that had guided human development from the shadows, nurturing civilizations like farmers tending crops, waiting for the harvest. The 13 hybrids collapsed simultaneously, their bodies unable to contain the energies flowing through them. But their sacrifice was calculated, their life force channeled directly into the dimensional breach that now gaped above Victoria's head. Through this wound in reality, appendages that defied description began to emerge, testing the stability of physical laws. Across the globe, Fairfax agents activated their final protocols. Economic systems collapsed as carefully placed individuals triggered cascading failures. Wars erupted between nations whose leaders suddenly found themselves compelled by impulses they couldn't understand. Religious movements turned violent as ancient symbols appeared in their sacred texts overnight, replacing familiar words with hieroglyphs that inspired both worship and terror. The psychic energy generated by global chaos fed directly into Victoria's ritual. Every scream of fear, every moment of despair, every instance of madness contributed to the weakening of dimensional barriers. The entities beyond required this emotional harvest to fully manifest in physical reality, and humanity's suffering was the key to their emergence. Victoria herself was no longer recognizably human. Her consciousness had expanded to encompass multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing her to perceive the true scope of what was unfolding. She saw the earth as her patrons saw it, a carefully prepared breeding ground where organic intelligence had been cultivated and refined across millennia, reaching the perfect moment for transcendence. The final phase began as Victoria spoke words in languages that predated human vocal cords. The dimensional breach widened, and through it came beings that existed as much in concept as in physical form. They were hunger given shape, intelligence without compassion, creativity expressed through destruction. They had waited patiently for the Fairfax bloodline to prepare their entry point, and now they poured through like water through a broken dam. Reality rewrote itself to accommodate their presence. Physical laws became suggestions rather than constants. Gravity flowed like liquid, time moved in spirals, and space folded into configurations that made navigation impossible for three-dimensional beings. The very atoms of matter began vibrating at frequencies that would eventually tear apart the molecular bonds holding the world together. As the ancient entities established their foothold in physical reality, Victoria Fairfax achieved her family's ultimate goal. The Fairfax name would be remembered not as human nobility, but as the catalyst for humanity's evolutionary leap into something unrecognizable. Their centuries of sacrifice, their embrace of darkness, their systematic corruption of human institutions had all led to this moment when the barriers between worlds finally shattered. The transformation was irreversible. The Earth would never again be a purely human domain. The Fairfax legacy was complete. Their pact with entities beyond human comprehension finally fulfilled. In the end, they had not simply served their alien patrons, they had become the bridge through which an entirely new phase of existence could begin. The age of humanity was ending. The age of the Fairfax design had begun.